So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for supporting young people with speech, language and communication needs in mainstream schools with two of our fantastic therapists, Jane Handley and Kirsten Johnson. My name is Millie and I'll be chairing today's webinar. So just a few things before we get started. Like I said before, just please type any questions you have into the chat box, any comments as well throughout the webinar, and we'll answer these at the end of the session. The webinar will be recorded and this will be made available on AT Therapy's website as well as our YouTube channel. You'll receive a link to this at the end or in the next couple of days, once it's all been uploaded. So I'll hand it over now to Kirsty and Jane. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Kirsty. I just want to set out what the aims of the session are today. So we're going to be looking at being able to understand what SLCN means and the different types of SLCN in mainstream schools. Hopefully we're going to be able to help you to understand how speech and language therapists can support children with SLCN in mainstream schools, and also for you to understand a little bit more about interagency working as well, and that will be with specific reference to some individual case studies that that Jane and I have come up with, and talking about some children who we've worked with. So hopefully that'll be quite interesting. So first of all, we need to have a think about what does SLCN mean? So SLCN, it stands for Speech, Language and Communication Needs. It's the umbrella term that we use to describe children who find it difficult to talk, understand and communicate with others. So children with SLCN, they may have difficulty with only one speech, language or communication skill, or maybe with several. And then some difficulties are short term, others are more permanent and may remain until and throughout adulthood. Looking at some of the statistics around children with SLCN in mainstream school, it's estimated that around 10% of children starting school have SLCN, which approximately works out around 2 to 3 children in every classroom. And then thinking about SLCN, it's commonly identified, it's the most commonly identified as special education needs and disability in primary schools in the UK. And then thinking about looking at some of the national tables, it was in 2019, it was 185,966 children in English state funded primary schools were identified as having SLCN. So why is it important for us as speech and language therapists to support children with SLCN in mainstream schools? I was quite interested to read quite a lot of research around the impact that SLCN has. It has lasting outcomes and impact on outcomes, both in relation to the progress that a child makes in terms of the success within education. So that's things like academic qualifications, but also things around developing social relationships as well, and thinking about opportunities in terms of a future career and future employment. It really has often quite a negative impact in terms of those opportunities. One of the things that I found quite interesting as well when I was doing a little bit of research is just around the fact that vocabulary at 5 years old is a strong predictor of the qualifications achieved at school leaving age and beyond. So thinking about really why it's so important for us as speech and language therapists to support children. And part of that is early identification. That's absolutely crucial. I was sort of talking to Jane earlier just around my experience working into mainstream schools. Certainly when I qualified as a speech and language therapist back in 2014, it was quite uncommon for teachers to have had sort of SLCN explained and talked about in any depth during their sort of teacher training. So my role certainly when I've worked into mainstream schools has been really to help support school staff and support staff and helping to make sure that children receive appropriate and timely intervention. So thinking about the types of SLCN in mainstream schools. We've just got a brief slide here which outlines some of the main difficulties. So we may well find children who have difficulties understanding or using vocabulary. We also come across children who have difficulty possibly understanding language and processing long or complex instructions. And we also may find children who have difficulties expressing their thoughts, ideas. They find it difficult to retell a story, problem solve. Sometimes we find children who have whose difficulties are more with their expressive language. Sometimes it's more with their understanding, or sometimes it's a combination of both. And sort of our role as speech and language therapists is to really find out where those difficulties lie when we do our assessments, and obviously we liaise with yourself, teachers and teaching staff, to really find out what those difficulties are. Other difficulties are difficulties with social communication. We work with children who may have difficulty with social understanding, problem solving, making friends and sustaining friendships, as well as the more sort of common things that when we talk about speech and language therapy, lots of sort of people think, oh, you work with children who have speech sound difficulty. That tends to be you know, the more sort of obvious difficulty that most people associate with our work. So we do work with children with speech sound difficulties, stammering, children with voice problems, and also those children who have eating and drinking difficulties, and that's known as dysphagia. And that any sort of assessment or intervention with children in mainstream schools who have those sort of problems are undertaken and seen by a specialist speech and language therapist who's had some qualifications, post sort of qualifications in terms of learning a little bit more about dysphagia. So I'm not dysphagia trained, but Jane is. So there's a few of us within AT who have a specialism and know a little bit more about eating and drinking difficulties.
So we'll just go through now some of the common causes of speech, language and communication needs we often see in the mainstream school setting. So first up, we have delayed speech and language communication skills. Sometimes this can be associated with a more general delay in skill development, or it could occur on its own. There's disordered speech, language and communication skills. That's when a child isn't following the same pattern of speech, language and communication development as you would normally expect. So delayed is when it follows the same pattern, but it's just not where it should be. Disordered is when it's very atypical. It's disordered essentially, and quite a few children are diagnosed with developmental language disorder. So that's when their language development is more disordered. We also see lots of speech, language and communication needs associated with neurodivergent learning profiles or specific learning differences. So what that means, it's those learning differences such as autism, ADHD and dyslexia. So those very specific learning profiles. We also see a lot of speech, language, communication needs that may be associated with neurological differences. So when there's been differences in either brain development or it's an acquired brain injury. So that could happen at birth if a baby's starved of oxygen, or if there's been a road traffic accident. Sometimes we see stroke, unfortunately, in children. Syndromes, so that might be some kind of genetic abnormality. An example is Down syndrome. We work a lot with children with social, emotional and mental health needs. There's a lot of SLCN that are associated with a wider profile of social, emotional and mental health needs in children and young people. In terms of speech sound difficulties that was touched on earlier, if we think about the different causes, sometimes children might have a phonological disorder or a phonological delay. It can be as a result of a structural abnormality, or such as a cleft palate. And then there's dysarthria, which is usually that's when it's either associated with a brain injury or some kind of nerve damage. So that's when the actual muscles aren't working as they should. Voice problems, they can be structural or neurological, again, nerve damage, or psychogenic when it's a functional problem. There's no structural or neurological difficulty there. And finally, we've got stammering, which can be developmental, and a lot of children go through that developmental phase of stammering. Sometimes that can persist, and that's when we get involved. Or it can be acquired, which is quite common after brain injury, to suddenly develop a disfluency. Okay, so how do we support speech, language and communication needs in mainstream schools? So we're going to talk a little bit now about how we work. So if we think about the waves of intervention model, this is a framework that's used across most mainstream settings, across primary and secondary. It's used by a lot of local education authorities to help with their provision mapping for special educational needs. And it's a way of looking at being able to identify which children need intervention at what kind of level, and when we need to start thinking of getting external agencies involved. So at the bottom, we've got wave one. That is basically inclusive, quality first teaching for all. So that's that general differentiation of learning that should be going on in the classroom for all children. Wave two, that's when there are additional interventions to enable children to work at age-related expectations or above. And wave three, that's when a child needs additional highly personalised interventions or highly specialist interventions. So we're just going to go through those in a little bit more detail and just explain how speech and language can support at each of those waves of intervention. Okay, so we'll start off looking at the universal, which is that wave one level. So what does that involve? So it involves us supporting really good practice strategies that can be embedded in that quality first teaching. And often what that looks like is helping the school develop communication friendly learning environments. In addition to that, Kirsty touched on this earlier, we really want to make sure schools know how to identify children and young people at risk of SLCN as early as possible, to understand the red flags for those more persistent and more complex difficulties, and know how to refer as well, so we can get those timely referrals into the service. That tends to be done through a lot of staff training, and we support with audits as well, in terms of looking at any training needs across in terms of the staff, and those communication friendly learning environments as well. Support into universal at a universal level is usually commissioned as part of it's a commissioned or traded service, so it's not usually part of the core NHS offer, so it's over and above usually what core NHS offer would be. Okay, moving up the triangle, we have targeted. So this is the wave two. So this is the support for those children and young people who have delayed speech, language and communication skills, and they're going to need a bit of targeted support to catch up. So the work that we do here includes a consultation, training and skill development for school and school staff to apply specific strategies or training programs to help develop those speech, language and communication needs and get them up to where they need to be. And they're often time limited interventions as well. So a child may access a program for a term, for example. The programs are usually delivered by a learning support assistant. Examples include Talk Boost, Black Sheep Press narrative intervention, language legends. There's lots of different packages out there. They tend to be off-the-shelf packages, and they cover a really good broad-based foundation of skill development. And again, it's usually part of a commissioned or traded service and not part of the core NHS offer. Although if it is commissioned as a traded service, it may be that the speech language therapist will do a lot more work at that targeted level. Okay, specialists. This is where we really come in to support at this highly specialist level. So this is your tier 3. Not many children, that's why it's at the top of the tier, and it's the smallest portion of the triangle, because not many children will require this level of support. But this is when the schools have taken identified a child's special educational needs. They've taken them through quality first teaching, maybe some targeted intervention. They've reviewed their progress. They're not making progress. They're still quite significantly behind where age-related expectations. So this is when the school decide that we need some external support now from external agencies, and this is where we come in. So it's often, but not always, as part of the start of the journey towards a child receiving an education and healthcare plan, which is a plan which it's a legally binding document, and it sets out all the support and the needs of the child and all the support requirements for that child, and to make sure that that's in place. So we can come in at the stage of they call it SCN support. So just before a child receives an education healthcare plan, we may become involved in terms of the assessment process, so to identify what the needs are of that child. So in order to do this, a formal referral with parental consent is needed to access the specialist assessment, and all referrals are triaged by a qualified speech and language therapist. And this is where we complete in-depth assessment in order to make that differential diagnosis. And we'll come up with a detailed report containing recommendations, treatment plans where appropriate. Those treatment plans will include very specific outcomes and goals, particularly if a child has an MSP, a My Support plan, or goes on to have an education healthcare plan. That's really important. So these goals are then reviewed after each episode of treatment or episode of care. Usually at this level, the packages of care are really bespoke, which means they're really tailored. They're not an off-the-shelf package. They're really tailored packages of care, and they can be delivered by a speech and language therapist, speech and language therapy assistant, or a learning support assistant, usually a higher level learning support assistant under the guidance of a speech and language therapist.
I'm back. So how is speech and language therapy delivered to school-age children? And I think there's actually quite a difference really between, obviously there's difference just between Jay and myself in terms of the experience that we've had working with children. From my perspective, I tended to work individually if I was working directly with a child. I didn't actually do any group therapy in my previous role, but I do know that groups are quite successful, especially for children who may have sort of phonological awareness targets. I know that's quite a common way of indirect therapy being delivered quite successfully in a group. So thinking about whether we do face-to-face or whether we do indirect therapy. Obviously face-to-face means working sort of specifically with a speech and language therapist or speech and language therapy assistant, or whether it's done indirectly. So we will set targets and we will share those with a teacher or learning assistant to deliver those. And again, thinking about where we might deliver the therapy. From my perspective, in terms of my previous role, a lot of my sessions were conducted inside the classroom. I tended to work into schools quite often, but we did also offer clinic appointments as well, especially for things like initial assessment appointments, and also tended to offer clinic appointments more often outside of school hours and during the school holidays as well. And then this next one, the remote sessions via video call, that's really come to its own, obviously over the past few years while we've been going through the pandemic. I hadn't had any experience prior to the last couple of years of delivering any remote sessions. And then in my last role, when we sort of went back into working into the hospital where I worked, we started to do attend anywhere appointments via video call. So I tended to do a lot of sort of reviews and initial assessments via video call. But obviously remote sessions are also useful for therapy as well, although I haven't as yet delivered any sort of remote therapy sessions. But it's a new way of working, and yeah, it's shown to be very successful, and I'm hoping to deliver more therapy, delivering it via video call remotely in my current role. So I'm looking forward to doing that. So thinking about our involvement and where we are as speech and language therapists, really, I would say the consultative model has emerged as the main alternative to the traditional model of where therapy was provided by a speech and language therapist. When I went into being a speech and language therapist, that's certainly the idea that I had in my mind, that if you needed speech and language therapy, you went to a clinic and it was delivered in a one-to-one setting. But I think changes in education provision have meant that we're seeing more children with additional needs attending mainstream schools, and with inclusion, it just sort of makes sense to try and and involve the speech and language therapist in the mainstream school. So it involves the SLT focusing more on work with parents, teachers, teaching assistants, and less on direct intervention with children.
So we thought we'd give you a whistle-stop tour, really, of the kinds of interventions, speech and language therapy interventions you might see in mainstream school settings. It's not an exhaustive list. Unfortunately, we aren't able to go into any detail in this webinar with regards to individual interventions, but hopefully this will just give you a good overview of what you might expect. So if we look at language interventions first, so one of the core foundation language skills that we work on is vocabulary. So there's a lot of off-the-shelf programs available, which are frameworks of intervention that it's basically a packaged intervention that's ready to go. So for busy TAs, it's something that they can grab and work with, and these are quite often delivered in groups. So you'll often see these at the targeted level. So that wave 2 for those children and young people that just need that boost. You might see informal vocabulary games. So what looks like games are actually really effective interventions. These might focus on giving word definitions, categorizing, odd one out games, and word association games. So what words are related. Okay, moving on to children and young people who may have difficulties at the level of expressive language. So being able to create that sentence structure and use grammar appropriately. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, but colourful semantics is one that's used a lot. It's used a lot out in mainstream settings anyway, as part of literacy. Shape coding, that's something it's more of a specialist intervention, really, and that's when that's looking more specifically at grammar. Okay, and then we move on to more higher level language interventions. So you might see these more as we're getting into juniors. So this is working on the language of the curriculum now, really. It's working on language to help with their learning. So we look at things like sequencing ideas, narrative, so that they're able to get their thoughts together in a clear order. and also verbal reasoning. So this is, again, it's higher level skills. It involves things like inferencing, which is when you're reading between the lines, picking up on information that's not being made explicit, things like problem solving, so being able to negotiate, make justifications, explain. So again, there are lots of resources out there. So this is just, I've just given a few examples here: language for thinking, reading between the lines. Okay, moving on to social communication. This is an area really schools use a lot of resources to develop social and emotional skills within the school setting anyway. So this, for us, our role is really, it's about developing that social understanding, social problem solving, and developing those appropriate social responses and social behaviour. So a lot of the resources that we would use, things like social thinking, talking about scenarios, which are really nice for that social problem solving, situational understanding, working out what's happening in a situation. We've got I put zones of regulation. This is one that sometimes speech therapists will implement, sometimes occupational therapists, sometimes schools will just run with it. And this is more of an emotional regulation type of intervention. And lastly, a brick by brick program, which is based on the principles of Lego based therapy. So again, that's a therapy for developing those dynamic, in the moment social interaction skills.
Moving on to some speech interventions, and again, just a couple of the things that I'm going to talk about today. Obviously, there's definitely more therapy around sort of helping to address any sort of speech delay or speech disorder that a child presents with. But the reason why I've just chosen these to focus on is because these might be activities that maybe a teaching assistant or teacher has been asked to do. So looking at the first one, so phonological awareness activities. Often when a therapist's working on sound in speech therapy, we look at developmental patterns and we try and consider which sounds are more delayed than others. But before working on helping a child to produce sounds, we need to ensure that a child can actually hear and tell the difference between different sounds. So phonological awareness activities that we might ask a teaching assistant to do. It might be things like helping a child to identify whether two words rhyme. It might be thinking about syllable clapping activities, and then working up eventually to being able to identify and blend individual sounds. So they're really the types of things that are quite easy in terms of activities for maybe you know, other people other than the therapist to be doing to help develop a child's phonological awareness. The other intervention that we commonly do, and it might be one again that if there's any sort of TAs that are on the webinar today might be more familiar with, is minimal pairs therapy. So what minimal pairs therapy involves, it's a contrastive approach, and it's a common way to help treat children with speech delay and speech disorders. And it's suitable for children who are making speech sound errors, but they're no longer age appropriate. So the example I've given here is when a child might make one sound in place of another. So they might use a t instead of a k. So car sounds like tar. So what we do is we get some minimal pairs. So they're pictures of words. So for example, with car and tar, so they'd have the same vowel, but they're a different initial consonant sound. And our work involves helping the child to learn to say the k sound. So if they pick up a picture of a car and say tar, the adult who's working with the child would pick a picture of tar, just to let the child know that they need to produce the k sound in order for the adult to know what they're trying to communicate. So thinking about what joint working means in mainstream school, before we sort of go on and talk about our own individual sort of little case studies, if you like, Jen and I sort of had to think about what it meant to work in partnership in schools. So working in partnership with the school SENCO and parents, we need to be able to support, to screen, which we've already mentioned, and identify young children who are at risk of SLCN, and to make sure that appropriate referrals are made by teaching staff. We need to make sure that we always involve those others around us, so detailed discussion of children's needs and the support needed to meet those needs, with training offered as necessary. And we'll talk a bit, as I say, in our own individual case sort of studies, but joint goal setting, planning, intervention and reviewing progress are really key to successful partnership working in school, as is attending EHC planning and review meetings. And thinking about some of the other agencies who are involved with a child or young people, got a list here. So we work with educational psychologists, we might work with a clinical psychologist, a therapy team, so physios, OT, specialist outreach services, and even medical team liaising with GPs, consultant paediatricians around reports, and the social care team.
Thank you, Kirsty. So we're going to move on now to talk a little bit more about our personal experience of working in mainstream schools. So I worked as part of, I worked previously in the NHS, and I worked as part of the mainstream schools team, where we covered specific geographical areas. So my caseload included children from year 1 up to college. So we worked with children 5 to 18 years in the mainstream schools team. We mainly dealt with language and social communication needs. So if it was phonology, if it was speech sounds or stammering, they would access a different part of the service. We'd often work as part of the EHCP assessment process to provide evidence of need, as we discussed earlier. So we might come in at the point of when a child is identified at that SEND support level. So that's the first steps towards gaining the EHCP. For anyone that isn't familiar with the EHCP process, so a child who is identified as having special educational needs, and they're not making progress with the targeted support that's been put in place, then they move to the next level of SEND support, which is called a My Support Plan. So the My Support Plan, then it becomes a little bit more formalised. The school will put in place really specific goals. They will get external agencies on board at this point as well. And then there's a process of reviewing those support plans. So every 3 months, then you can apply for an EHCP once your My Support Plans have been reviewed 3 times and there's still no evidence of progress. It's at that point that a school can apply for an EHCP. So it's quite a long, complex process. But the EHCPs are really for those children that do have those really quite complex support needs, really, with regards to their learning and accessing the curriculum. So I worked predominantly in the mainstream schools team. It was predominantly a consultative model. So that's to say we would mainly consist of assessment, advice, possibly some intervention from the speech language therapy assistant, but a lot of the programs would be delivered by the higher level teaching assistants under the guidance of speech and language. Another part of my role was specialist assessment for pupils with complex communication and interaction needs, who were going through tribunal or whose needs were being reassessed due to the local authority not being able to meet their needs in mainstream. So the part of my role was working with those children and young people that have had an EHCP in place, and for whatever reason it's still not working. So we're looking at whether mainstream settings are appropriate for those pupils. I also had weekly input into the complex communication and interaction specialist provision, which was attached to one of the local authorities' mainstream secondary schools. The case study that I'm going to talk about today is a young man who attended our specialist provision, our secondary specialist provision. So I'll tell you a little bit about the setting and what the speech and language therapy input looked like into that provision. So they received one session a week from myself, which was a session initially half a day, so it was a morning a week. I'd provide yearly assessment updates for the EHCP reviews, because each child attending the specialist provision would need an EHCP to attend. I delivered really bespoke packages of care, really tailor-made, because of really complex children and young people in the provision. So that would be delivered by myself, some of it by the high-level teaching assistants under SALT supervision. It also involved really close working with a specialist teaching team. A lot of it was almost like dynamic problem solving, so thinking about working through situations as they arose. So if there was a young person who was really dysregulated because of something had happened, then we would all sit down and we'd work and problem solve and come up with some solutions as a team. Part of my input also included regular multi-agency professional meetings, which were really, really useful. So every term we'd sit down, it was myself, teacher in charge of provision, the specialist teacher, the educational psychologist attached to the provision, and the occupational therapist who was trained in sensory integration. She was amazing. She'd been commissioned directly by our local educational authority to meet the sensory needs of a lot of children and young people who were struggling in mainstream. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit more in detail about a young man who came to us in year 7, diagnosis of autism, really significant difficulties with emotional regulation and anxiety, so could flare up at the drop of a hat, and mainstream school were just not able to meet his needs. He'd been to I don't know how many, 2 or 3 different mainstream primaries in the authority, and most of the mainstream secondaries also, so they couldn't meet his needs. But they didn't feel it was appropriate to send him for him to attend a special school, because he was really academically able. So he was placed in specialist provision. So to get to know him, we completed a comprehensive multidisciplinary team assessment. So that was quite a few weeks, letting him settle, really getting to know him through just informal observation. And I had lots and lots of discussions with parents and key staff and other professionals as well. So over that time, I was able to identify some language and communication needs, but as a team, we all agreed that he had some very significant sensory needs, and also his emotional regulation. There were areas of priority, really. So a big piece of work was put in place with the sensory OT, and the educational psychologist did a lot of work around emotional regulation. He ended up with they developed a power up corner. He had a sensory diet. I just at that point just gave advice, really, based on the information that I'd been able to gather up to now, on adjusting their interaction style. So for key staff working with him to use a declarative language style, which basically it reduces demands and it helps support that dynamic kind of problem solving, and his ability to stop and think and talk through what he's feeling and the steps he needs to take now. And also advice was given around supporting higher level language needs, because his language profile appeared to be, we talked earlier about those higher level language difficulties at the narrative level. So being able to get your thoughts in a coherent order to be able to make sense. and get your message across. Also verbal reasoning, so just gave advice to help him develop that ability to discuss, to problem solve, to negotiate, to justify, all those things that he was really, really struggling with. And that was in addition to ideas for differentiation of learning, because at this point he still wasn't attending out in the mainstream classrooms. He was in base, he was having initially one-to-one tuition, and then we started bringing in some trusted peers to work with him. So at this point he was still working within the base of the specialist provision. We also made a referral to CAMS, an external agency, due to concerns around his mental health, particularly anxiety. Okay. So once he'd settled and he was starting to, we'd addressed his sensory needs and he was settled, he was much more regulated. That's when I began a period of assessment through intervention. So still not sitting down with the really formal assessment that we might do with other children and young people. This was very formal. It was very, didn't want to place too many demands on him, because that we knew that now that was quite a trigger for him. So it was quite a long process to gain trust, to develop that therapeutic relationship. But he slowly started to be able to self-regulate more and even integrate into some mainstream lessons with support. So by late spring, so bearing in mind he'd come in September, I was able to complete a formal assessment now. So he did sit down and he was able to cope with those demands. It was differentiated, and if he felt like I could see that he was getting a little bit dysregulated, then we would stop and I could come in the next week, we could pick it up then. And that formal assessment then identified what we'd already picked up through the informal assessment. So by this point we had a really good picture of his needs, was able to update recommendations, and we continued working on really key, really important skill known as global processing. It basically means being able to identify relevant information to see the bigger picture to support social understanding. Because in a lot of children with autism, they have difficulty working out what's relevant, and it's almost like they can't see the woods for the trees. They see too many trees, and so it really supports that social understanding to develop that bigger picture thinking. We also did a lot of social problem solving. So this did include some of the off-the-shelf resources we talked about earlier, things like the talk about resource has some nice ideas there to discuss things like what's the difference between being assertive, being aggressive, being passive. But his was much more bespoke. It was highly relevant to him, and it also involved a lot of social problem solving in terms of issues arising as well. So if something had happened in that preceding week, we could sit down and we could problem solve that. So this intervention just has continued, and he's just finished year 10. He's completely integrated into mainstream now. He's expected to complete his GCSEs and go on to become a car mechanic, which is amazing. So he's been one of our real success stories from coming in, where we thought there was a point when we thought, can we actually meet this young person's need in this setting? Because the provision, it was a base, but it was within a mainstream environment. So it was still, there was, they had to navigate really busy corridors. They had to navigate those social dynamics in the mainstream classroom and understand behaviour policy, all things like that. And obviously it's differentiated, but he did, to get to where he has done, he's done really well. Thanks, Kirsty.
Okay, I'm just conscious we might be running a little bit to a deadline now, so I'll just do a very quick overview of my own personal experience of working into mainstream. It's actually very different to Jane's, but hopefully it'll provide you with a little bit of a contrast in terms of sort of the therapy that I did, and obviously the types of children that I worked with. So I worked as part of a specialist team. I was a specialist locality therapist. And I covered a specific geographical area. So my caseload included children from preschool up to year 6, so 2 to 11-year-olds. I worked mainly into nurseries and schools as part of a commissioned traded service, actually. So I had lots of opportunities to develop those sort of skills, working with others, working with teachers, working with teaching assistants. I undertook initial assessments, reviews of children, and carried out therapy as well. And my role also involved sort of liaising with team around the family meetings, safeguarding meetings, working with health visitors, social workers, and family support workers as well, in addition to school support staff. So thinking about my role within a mainstream primary school, especially sort of working and doing school contracts, it was really important to work collaboratively. And I just wanted to share a few of the things that I found worked really well for me in terms of making my time in school as effective as I could, and obviously helping to ensure the best outcomes for the children I worked with. So I'd arrange a meeting with the school head or SENCO at the start of every school term, at the beginning of the school contract rather, and I tried to meet termly, if not half termly, to discuss the children on the caseload and priorities and how we were going to meet the child's needs. We discussed different ways of how I work. So the school were very familiar that I might work direct with a child, I might work indirectly, I might do some observations in class. And also it was really important to open up those different ways of communicating, and the best way for me to be able to communicate and to provide feedback. So some schools that I worked in preferred me to try and meet with staff at lunchtime, at break time. Other schools I worked into preferred me to provide more written feedback, and I might do that anonymously over email, but always ensuring that I exchange numbers and the school team knew how to contact me and where to contact me. And where teaching assistants were delivering therapy, providing opportunities for them to observe sessions, that was really key. It did tend to be teaching assistants who I worked with mainly, who were delivering any sort of indirect interventions or doing any carryover work. So I'd never expect a teaching assistant to deliver any intervention without having had the opportunity to at least observe a session or to chat through the targets and to be shown the resources and how to use those appropriately. So my case study is a little bit different to Jane's, but it's a child I work with, a girl in year 3, LB, and actually I work with her across 2 settings. I started work with her in mainstream primary, and then her sessions finished in clinic. Her diagnosis was that she had an articulation disorder. Without going into anything too technical, she was producing active nasal fricatives. So when she was doing her sound, air was coming down her nose rather than orally. She had no other speech sound difficulties, and she'd actually been seen earlier, but she'd been discharged because she'd been seen when she was younger, and she wasn't motivated at a younger age to work on her speech, and it wasn't having a massive impact on her in terms of her motivation or concern around how she sounded. However, by the time the re-referral came in, she was that bit older, she was 7, and she was more aware that she sounded different to her peers. So in terms of my involvement with her, following assessment, I had a meeting with both mum and teaching staff. This type of therapy, it does need some specialist input, but it also requires carryover work to be carried out as well by those around her. It wouldn't be something that I could just fix, if you like, through weekly sessions. So it was very important that we had those discussions with mum, it was, and teaching staff to discuss the level of input and what carryover work would be required to make the therapy successful. But what was also important about working with LB was that we wanted to discuss functional goals. What was the ultimate goal for LB? Yes, she wanted to be able to say her sound, but what did that mean for her in terms of her life, really? And actually what she wanted to do was be able to stand up with her friends and deliver a brownie promise. So I'm conscious we're nearly out of time, are we? I've got time just to quickly run through a couple of bits.
Just a couple of minutes, Kirsty, and then we'll have to
So just in a nutshell, really the input was successful. It involved some early sessions with me, delivering some specialist input. We managed to target this sound and isolation, close working with a teaching assistant to encourage practice of that sound and isolation. Once we got it in isolation, so that's just producing the sound by itself, we stepped up to generating it in word level, and then the block of therapy finished in school, and then we were able to continue some joint clinic sessions, and actually involved grandma coming, and she actually attended every session, and she was able to obviously observe what we're doing, obtain carryover work to do between sessions, and the outcome was that LB she was able to produce her sound at sentence level and successfully delivered her brownie promise, which was a great feeling for me as a therapist in terms of looking at a functional goal. So just very quickly, takeaways, what makes effective sort of joint working, MDT working. Jane and I feel that looking at the child holistically, working with the MDT, putting the child and family at the centre of any decision making, joint assessment, care planning, shared goals and objectives where possible, being aware of others' roles and boundaries. So we wouldn't expect a teaching assistant to deliver therapy that was for more of a specialist intervention, and good communication, really, information sharing, and obviously Jane had more sort of regular MDT meetings, but that really did help to ensure joint problem solving. So there we go, that is us, and that's the reference for the outcomes that I talked about earlier.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Jane and Kirsty. It was really fantastic. It's great to hear as well about those success stories about both your clients. It's very it's great when you get to see that progress with your clients. So now we'll just quickly open the discussion. There was a question on the chat. Can you recommend resources to support global processing?
Global processing, yeah. So really simply, it's a really easy one to work on. It's basically looking at pictures, and it's making sure that you're talking about what you can see and why is it relevant and what does that mean. So I sometimes have a notepad with me, and I write down in a little table what I can see in the picture, what do I know about this, and what do I think this means. So what it's training the child or young person to do is to just step back, notice the details, but then understand what's relevant, and then being able to come up with and make sense of what's happening. So it's almost like you as an adult then you've got a really important role in almost thinking aloud and shaping that child's way of thinking and the way that child's seeing the world. But it's really simple, but it's so effective.
That sounds really really interesting. Thank you, Jane. We just have a poll now to launch, which would be great if you could answer it. She'll be popping up on your screen now. That's just about how useful you found the webinar today, and if you recommend it going forwards. Would you mind skipping to the next slide, please, for me, Jane?
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, I hope I didn't press something I shouldn't have.
No, I think
that's it.
Oh, we're still on the discussion slide. I'll just talk through it. Do we have some other resources available on our YouTube channel as well as our Instagram account? So keep an eye out for freebies on there. We also have some really good events coming up. We have a level 1 Macathon in September. It's a one-day course that will be held at our offices in Oldham, and that will be delivered by Sally Fenton. We also have a play included training that Jane mentioned briefly in the webinar. That'll also be in September. This is a one-day training course at our offices as well in Oldham, and this will be delivered by one of our clinical managers, Nikki. I'm just getting a message that the poll's disappeared. I'll just relaunch that. Okay, hopefully that should be back on your screens now. Thank you for letting me know. You can follow what courses we have available on Eventbrite. You can also keep an eye out on any of our socials for future webinars and any other training courses we've got coming up. Our next lunchtime webinar will be presented by Kerry Higgins. She will be presenting strategies to support children and young people with social, emotional and mental health issues. This will be in September as well, on the 22nd at 12. So I look forward to watching that, and I hope to see you all there. So thank you for listening to today's webinar. And if you've got any more questions, please feel free to email us at info@attherapy.co.uk. So thank you again, Kirsty.